Chapter 7 of Optimism Bias. Why is Friday better than Sunday? The value of anticipation and the cost of dread. 119.5 seconds is the time it takes to pour and serve a perfect pint of Guinness. The glass is held at exactly a 45-degree angle under the tap next the famous double pour. The glass is filled up 3/4 of the way and left to settle. Once the bubbles settle, creating a creamy head, the glass is topped off. The double pour ritual originated back when the dark Irish liquid was served straight from the barrel. The bartender would prepare glasses filled 3/4 of the way with older stout, then leave them to stand. When a customer came in to order a pint, the bartender would top up the glass with a fresher, younger stout, which produced the foamy top. Nowadays, a pint of Guinness is no longer a mix of old and new stout, yet the double pour tradition remains. In fact, it is mandatory. Guinness has instituted the Perfect Pint training program, which ensures that whenever the World Guinness is served, the double pour technique is used, creating the perfect creamy head, which is about 1/3 to 1/2 inch in depth. Did the double pour technique survive the years simply because it creates a foamy head and does not overfill the glass? Not at all. The careful 119.5 second pour generates something much more important. It produces what some consider the most vital aspect of the Guinness experience: anticipation. In November 1994, dramatizing the thrill experienced while one eagerly waits for the cold stuff to settle down, Guinness came out with one of its most successful advertisements, Anticipation. As the ad was called, featured a customer dancing around in excitement while a bartender poured him a pint. The ad ran for only 60 seconds. Nevertheless, those 60 seconds and the campaign that followed the famous "Good things come from those who wait" had a huge impact. Guinness's sales went through the roof, and the brand recognition skyrocketed. The value of anticipation, what the marketing people of Guinness tapped into, was a central aspect of human nature we tend to overlook. The joy of savoring, sometimes expecting a good thing, is more pleasurable than actually experiencing it. Consider the hours blissfully spent daydreaming about an upcoming vacation we get our money's worth when we board the plane, or consider the excitement while getting ready for our keenly awaited date. All sorts of future scenarios running through our mind: the childhood enthusiasm weeks before Halloween, or an upcoming birthday, the exhilaration before reuniting with a loved one. I could go on and on. Although we have all felt joy of anticipation, we rarely consider its value explicitly when making decisions. How many of us have ever said, "Well, if you take into account the weeks of pleasure I will obtain from anticipating the trip to Venice, I shall guess $1,000 is not too much to spend on a weekend abroad." While we may not believe the anticipation is a source of satisfaction in and of itself, our actions reveal otherwise. Contemplate the scenario: your loving spouse has decided to buy you tickets to see your favorite band concert as a birthday gift. The band will be in town in a few weeks. When would you like to go? Your significant other asks. Tickets are available tonight, tomorrow night, or a show in 2 days' time, 5 days' time, or next week. Which date would you pick? When given the choice, people would rather wait a bit for a good thing than have it immediately. Most of us would choose to go to the concert later in the week rather than right away. In a survey conducted by George Lowenstein, an economist at Carnegie Mellon University, undergraduate students are asked how much they'd pay to receive a kiss from a celebrity of their choice. Imagine a passionate kiss from X. This is where you fill in the blank: Angelina, Brad, Patrick, Dempsey, Uma Thurman. After you make this tricky decision, write down how much you'd be willing to pay to receive a kiss from that person immediately, in an hour, 3 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, a year, or 10 years. Lowenstein found that the average person would pay no more to receive a kiss from a celebrity in a year than to receive immediately. An immediate kiss would leave zero time for anticipation, would be giving up the thrill of the wait, the pleasure derived from imagining the expected kiss, considering how and where it would take place. However, the kiss was expected in a week's time. One would frequently muse on the upcoming event. With each reflection, a brief moment of joy would be produced. Students even willing to pay a bit more to receive the kiss in a year's time rather than in 3 hours. They were not, however, willing to wait 10 years. Who knows if our object of desire will be desirable in a decade? The most preferred waiting time was 3 days, reflecting a balance between the pleasure of anticipation and impulsivity. We shall return to that role of impulsivity in a later chapter. The fact that people decide to wait for a rewarding event rather than receive it immediately suggests that we derive pleasure from contemplating something that might happen later, even if our current state is negative. For example, we are working late in the office on a Friday evening. We can feel happiness simply by thinking of the weekend ahead. In fact, when you ask people to rank the days of the week in order of preference, Friday is ranked higher than Sunday, although Friday is a work day and Sunday is not. Why would people rather work than play? Not quite. Saturday is also a day of play, ranked above both Friday and Sunday. So why do people prefer Friday to Sunday? The reason is that Friday brings promise, the promise of the weekend ahead and all the activities or non-activities we have planned. Sunday, while a day of rest, does not bring it the joy of anticipation. To the contrary, although we may be having a picnic in the park or strolling around town, those delightful activities are marred by the anticipation of the full work week ahead. Whether good or bad, our emotional state is determined by those feelings that are triggered by the world at present and those generated by our expectations of the future. Consider another scenario. You are at the dentist's office for your annual checkup. While examining your teeth, your dentist concludes that unfortunately you need a root canal. There is no patient scheduled after you, so the dentist can conduct the procedure right away. Alternatively, you could be penciled in later in the afternoon or for the next week. What do? When it comes to adverse events, most of us choose to get it over with as soon as possible. The reason is simple. We want to avoid the dread that comes with anticipating the pain. Instead of spending our time worrying and fearing why, we would rather face the pain immediately and be done with it. Indeed, when participants in Lowenstein's survey were asked how they would pay to avoid a $120 volt electric shock that would be delivered immediately in 3 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, a year, 10 years, the students indicated they were willing to pay the most to avoid a shock in 10 years. In fact, they were willing to pay almost double to avoid electric shock in 10 years than to avoid an immediate shock. In another study, where shocks were actually delivered, some participants were keen to avoid the dread. They opted to receive a larger electric shock immediately rather than a smaller, less painful one later. This decision may seem irrational. Traditional economic theorists would certainly claim so. According to these classic decision-making models, humans are rational agents who try to optimize expected utility. Utility is an economic term that refers to the relative desirability of an object, or the satisfaction we can derive from it. Electric shocks are neither desirable nor satisfactory, so if on a scale of 1 to not at all painful to 100 so painful one would rather die, we are expected 120 shock would be about a 40, and we are willing to pay $100 to avoid it. Then we would be willing to pay $100 to avoid it now, and $100 to avoid it in 10 years. That is because both cases we expect the shock to be painful in the same degree. Now let's say you are willing to pay $100 to avoid a shock today, and $200 to avoid a shock in a year. Although in both cases the expected behavior is 40 on the pain scale, this is a violation of rational behavior, or is it? What classic decision-making theories fail to account for is the negative value of dread. Many modern economic theories still fail to do so. If we take anticipation into account, the behavior described above seems perfectly rational. Yes, the expected pain from 120-volt shock is about 40 on the pain scale, whether we receive it now or in a decade, and avoiding it is worth about $100 either way. However, one has to consider the distress it would be caused by anticipating the shock over 10 years. Avoiding 10 years of dread may be worth an extra $100. Therefore, completely rational to be willing to pay double to avoid an adverse event in the future. Receiving the shock now means no time to contemplate the possible negative consequences, none of the sinking gut feeling that would emerge every time the thought of impending shock came into mind. Not only is it sensible to pay more to avoid a negative event in the future than to avoid one in the present. It is foolish not to. The negative influence of anticipation, an unwanted event, on our physical and mental health can sometimes be worse. The negative anticipation of an unwanted event on our physical and mental health can sometimes be worse than the effect of experiencing the event. This phenomenon was observed in the mid-1970s in employees of two manufacturing plants in the United States. One plant was located in a large metropolitan area, the other in a rural community with a population of 3,000. The first was a paint manufacturing plant. The second manufactured display fixtures used by wholesale and retail concerns. The employees of the two plants were machine operators, laboratory assistants, clerks in shipping departments, assembly line workers, and tool and die workers. On average, the employees had worked on their respective plants for 20 years. Sadly, both plants were scheduled to shut down, and all the workers were about to lose their jobs. For months, the men came to work knowing that in only a few weeks they would be unemployed. Anticipating the loss of their workplace, where they had spent most of their days for the past 2 decades, was stressful. The anxiety was triggered to a large extent by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. How would they cope with unemployment? Would they find another job? Scientists who followed these workers before and after the plants were closed found the employees experienced more days of illness before the plants were shut down than during the weeks of unemployment that followed. The anxiety-induced anticipation of the loss of their jobs damaged their health and well-being. Ironically, once unemployed, the workers became healthier. The uncertainty of how life would be without a job was lifted, anxiety was reduced, and attention returned to finding a new job, rather than worrying aimlessly about what might be. Anticipating the fall alters the impact. A few years ago, I received a surprise birthday present from a friend, a tandem skydive. To be clear, I never expressed any interest in jumping out of a plane in midair, falling through the sky of 15,000 feet from the ground, reaching speeds of approximately 120 miles per hour, was never on my wish list. All the same, that was exactly what I was about to do. My friend initially intended for the skydive to be a surprise. I was driven to a ranch in upstate New York where the skydiving school was located, and there was my birthday gift would be revealed. After careful consideration, however, my friend decided it might be wise to let me get used to the idea of jumping from a plane in advance so that I could prepare emotionally. Hence the surprise was unveiled 3 days beforehand. I now had 72 hours to ponder the upcoming jump. Depending on your personal preference, those 72 hours could be viewed as a time of pleasurable excitement or days of pure dread. The latter was my experience. I was walking around town with a death sentence hanging over my head. I turned to the internet for help, entering the word skydiving and perish on Google, revealed that approximately 30 people die every year in the United States while skydiving. This may seem a larger number at first, but considering the 2.5 million jumps that take place in the United States every year, it is in fact a small percentage. A closer investigation revealed that death or serious injury from tandem jumps which you are tied to an instructor, as I would be, are particularly rare. This is encouraging. Although I had experienced 3 days of stressful anticipation, after that time allowed me to acquire knowledge regarding the threatening event. My fear was reduced by the information I had gathered, allowing me to enjoy the experience more. Yes, I admit I ended up taking pleasure in the rush of adrenaline. Now imagine all this had taken place pre-Google. In fact, imagine it had been impossible for me to gather any information on skydiving, that I had no access to anyone who had jumped before or anyone who knew anything about the experience at all, and no statistics at hand. I would probably have spent 3 anxious days picturing the worst. Obviously, anticipating a potentially adverse event is unpleasant, but what does it also affect the way that we experience the event itself? How does the dread of root canal make it more adverse? Does the fear of a shock make it more painful? The neuroimaging study published the journal Science in 2006 suggests that in the case the scientists reported that people who dreaded an upcoming event found the actual shock worse than when they actually had to wait longer for it. In other words, if you are awfully anxious about getting that root canal, better do it as soon as possible. Not only will you avoid unpleasant anticipation, but the whole experience may seem less painful now than it would in a week. Interestingly, the amount of dread experienced before the shock did not alter brain activity during the shock itself. It was only before the shock that increased dread was related to heightened activity in the brain's pain matrix. The pain matrix is a network of brain regions that are associated with processing different aspects of the pain experience. This network includes the somatosensory cortex, which responds to the physical aspects of pain, as well as areas thought to respond to emotional processing, such as the amygdala and the rostral anterior cingulate. During the time of anticipation, people who dreaded the shock a lot had a greater activity in brain regions than people that usually process the physical intensity of pain, such as the somatosensory cortex. This means that the brain responded similarly to the anticipation of the shock and to the shock itself. Anticipation seemed to mimic the actual experience of pain. Dreaders also had greater activity in areas thought to modulate attention to pain, which suggests that dread enhanced attention to the physical aspects of the expected pain. If anticipating an adverse event activates areas of the brain that normally process the physical experience of pain, it is hardly surprising that anticipating a painful event has a negative effect on our well-being similar to that of actually experiencing it. In a like manner, anticipation of a pleasurable event seems to activate neural systems that are also engaged while actually experiencing the enjoyable event. For example, a study my colleagues and I conducted showed that when people imagined a future vacation, the striatum, a brain region that also responds to actual rewards such as food, sex, and money, is activated. This, of course, does not mean that imagining a vacation or a juicy cheeseburger is the same as actually being there on the beach or eating a burger. Yet sometimes the pleasure we obtain from thinking about a burger also comes to the pleasure we feel while sinking our teeth into one. Not all burgers are created equal. We may enjoy the moist burger with lettuce and cheese more than a dry one without toppings. We are also more likely to enjoy a burger when we are hungry than when we are full. But do these differences matter when we are only anticipating the burger? What determines how pleasurable we find anticipation? There are a few crucial factors. First, the tastier the burger is expected to be, the greater the pleasure from anticipating it. If we are about to have a green salad and peas, we will probably not derive much joy from anticipating our meal, unless of course we find salad and peas pleasing. Second, the more vividly we are able to imagine an event, the greater the pleasure from anticipating it. If we are unable to construct a detailed image of the burger, one that includes the smell and texture of it, anticipating will be less enjoyable. Third, however, probable you think the event influences how joyful anticipation will be. If we think there is no chance we will be able to leave the office for lunch, we will not derive much joy from imagining the unattainable burger. Finally, time matters. As lunchtime approaches, the excitement about the upcoming meal becomes greater and greater. The same principles apply when anticipating adverse events. The dread of Anticipating a root canal will be determined by how painful we think the procedure will be, how vividly we can imagine the noise and the vibration of the drill, how likely it is we will need a root canal, and when we expect it to take place. Let's go back to the dancing Guinness patron awaiting his drink. Does this particular customer perceive the Guinness pint to be half full or half empty? The patron is glass half full type of person. Will he derive more pleasure from anticipation? The optimism bias is by definition our tendency to overestimate the probability of positive events and underestimate the probability of negative ones. Notice that the nearer in time that we believe that we are when the root canal will take place, the greater the dread. People choose, however, to get the root canal sooner rather than later, because if they sum up the moments of dread from the present time to the time of the procedure, the total amount of experienced dread is greater than for a later root canal than the one that takes place sooner. That's not all. Optimistic people imagine positive future events with greater vividness and detail than negative events, and imagine them from occurring nearer in time. So the more positive you are, the more likely you are to imagine positive events as near in time, with greater detail, with higher probability than negative ones. Optimism thus modulates the same factors that influence the value of anticipation: predicted pleasure, vividness, the expected time of the event, and its probability. For desirable events such as a foamy pint of Guinness, optimism increases the joy of anticipation by increasing our expectation that we will receive our pint sooner rather than later, b, enhancing our ability to imagine the cool feel of the glass and the smooth flow of the substance, and c, increasing the perceived likelihood of receiving the stout. Pessimists, on the other hand, may have trouble vividly imagining the black stuff, will predict that the bartender will take a long time to deliver the stout, and may worry that he will run out of Guinness altogether. Although a pessimistic customer may enjoy the pint when it is fully delivered, he will be deprived of the 119.5 seconds of pleasure that precede consumption, and it is unlikely he will dance around the pub while waiting for his drink. The same rationale holds for the negative events such as unemployment. An optimist will estimate the likelihood of getting fired as low, will have a hard time imagining the scenario in detail, and will predict that even if the event does happen, it will be far, far in the future. The result, dread, anxiety, and stress are reduced. A pessimist, on the other hand, will be sure she'll get the next employment. Will be sure she'll be the next employee to go, possibly tomorrow, and will imagine the whole thing in gruesome detail. Anticipating unemployment, which may never come, is not only adversive, but will induce stress that will negatively affect physical and mental health. It seems plausible then that the optimism bias developed, partly because the optimism maximizes the pleasure we obtain from anticipating a good thing and minimizes the adversity of anticipating a bad thing. If a burger is equal to 100 units of joy, an optimist will obtain more units of joy than anticipating the burger than a pessimist, ultimately increasing the pleasure derived of the burger, enhancing well-being. So if optimists find anticipation more pleasurable than pessimists do, are they more likely to delay a gratification in order to increase the length of anticipation? The survivor dilemma. The answer is complex. This is because the value of anticipation is not the only factor that determines when we decide to indulge. There is at least one other crucial factor: temporal discounting. Temporal discounting is a tendency to value the present more than the future. For example, if you're given a choice between receiving $100 today or $100 in a month, you're most likely take the money today. That is an easy decision. However, if you were to be given $100 today and $105 in a month, what will you do? Most people would rather have $100 today than $105 in a month. Some people would even take $100 today and over $150 next month. At first glance, and indeed at second, it seems like the temporal discounting steers our direction in a direction opposite from the anticipation. It drives us to consume goods as soon as possible and delay pain until sometime in the unforeseeable future. This is not only because we tend to value the here and now more than the there and later, but also because we correctly perceive the future as uncertain. We would rather eat our chocolate cake now than save it for later, because tomorrow we may find that the cat has already gobbled it up, or we may decide to delay cleaning the house until next week, because then our spouse may have already gotten around to it. However, if we know for certain that our spouse has no intention whatsoever of cleaning the house, we may decide to get to it as soon as possible and be done with it. Likewise, if we have a crystal ball that revealed that our scrumptious chocolate cake would stay fresh in the fridge and would not be eaten by anyone else, we might delay gratification a little bit longer to prolong anticipation. However, even if we lived in a magical universe with a fully predictable future, people would still discount the future to some extent. If we did not discount the future at all, we would never get around to actually eating the cake or opening that delicious bottle of wine we had been saving in the cellar. We'd be delaying gratifications again and again in order to extend pleasurable anticipation. Anticipation and temporal discounting pull us in different directions until an equilibrium is reached. While the pleasure of anticipation makes us patient creatures, temporal discounting makes us impulsive. Then what will we ultimately decide to do reflects the balance between these two factors. When the value obtained from anticipating a future reward is greater than the value of consuming the reward at present, we will delay our indulgence. However, when our desire to have the gourmet Swiss chocolate is greater than the joy of savoring it, we will tear into the wrapper. Many factors play a part in whether or not we will ultimately savor a product. Things that are available infrequently, such as an expensive bottle of champagne or an annual vacation, may be worth savoring. Something that can be had again and again, such as a kiss from our partner, is consumed whenever we feel the urge. Another factor that determines our decision is whether the object has a greater value now than we expect it to have in the future. Consider the reality show Survivor. In Survivor, innocent citizens from developed countries are taken to a deserted tropical island and left to fend for themselves. They are allowed to take only clothes on their back. No Blackberries, no iPods, or can openers are permitted. They're not even toilet paper. Contestants could avail themselves to anything they find on the island, such as bamboo and edible fruit. They receive a limited amount of water and food, usually some rice. At the end of their first day, the survivors are famished. They know, however, that while their hunger will only increase with passing day, their food supply may diminish. Should they save their limited amount of rice for later in the week? Should they divide it into small portions and half a bit every day? Should they eat it all now and hope for the best? The difficulty with making such a decision is that it relies on our ability to predict what and how much we will need in the future. This is not an easy problem. The survivors have to consider whether they expect to find additional food on the island and whether they can survive a few grams of rice a day. Elaine, an optimistic survivor, reckons that the group is sure to find plenty of berries and coconuts once the sun comes up. They may be able to catch some fish. She therefore suggests having rice tonight. That way, Elaine says, the group will have necessary energy to go hunting for food tomorrow. Patrick is less optimistic. He does not believe the group members will be successful in finding nourishment in the near future. He argues they should preserve the food as long as physically possible. Elaine, who favors eating now rather than saving for later, may appear on the surface to have a high discounting rate. This is an economic jargon for saying that she considers the present to be more important than the future. Economists assume that people with high discounting rates are impulsive. These individuals are thought to be not not to be concerned with the future as much as they should be. They don't have savings account, and they might indulge in unhealthy practices such as drinking and smoking, which carry penalties in the future. Elaine is not necessarily impulsive or unmindful of the future. Her preference to eat now rather than later is based on her optimistic expectations of what is yet to come. Under those rosy assumptions, it may be reasonable to consume the rice now rather than save it for tomorrow. To formally test whether optimism alters discounting grade, scientists at the University of Amsterdam conducted a study in which participants were asked to imagine being happily employed by a large company. The company was doing especially well, and the executives decided to reward all employees with a raise. The employees had a choice. They could either receive a raise that would begin immediately and last for 12 months after their salary would go back to its current rate, or they could receive a raise that would last for 36 months but did not go into effect for another 12 months. What should they do? Many participants elected the short-term raise, which would go into effect immediately, rather than the long-term raise, which didn't go into effect for a year. Why would they do that? Why would they choose a 12-month raise over a 36-month raise? Then the latter was obviously worth more. The Dutch employees hypothesized that people picked the short term immediately because they held optimistic opinions about what would follow. For example, the participants may believe that the company would continue to do well and would eventually decide to give the employees extra bonuses at the end of the 12 months. They may also be considered that the immediate raise would be invested, making them more money in the long run. To test this hypothesis, the experimenters conducted the study again, this time with a new group of participants. Only they added a small twist. The participants were presented with a scenario that was much more constrained than the one given to the first group. They were told the company would give the raise only once, discouraging the idea that gains would be followed by the additional ones. They were also informed that the raise would be adjusted for interest rates and inflation. The participants, therefore, had less room to generate alternative future scenarios of their own. Under these circumstances, in which the future was not open to rosy interpretation, more participants chose to wait for the longer bonus than to anticipate the smaller one immediately. Another group of participants was told that the company was not doing well and that all salaries would be cut by 10%. The employees would select whether to have their salary cut in 12 months or to have it reduced in a year's time for 36 months. When the future was relatively unconstrained, participants tend to pick the larger delayed loss than the small immediate one. Presumably, participants imagined the company might do better over time, but would eventually decide their salary reductions were not needed. After all, participants may also have imagined they could find a better paying job in a year, and thus avoid the salary cut altogether when the future was presented as certain, i.e., the scenario clearly stated that all cuts were fully guaranteed and the employees could not change jobs. More participants opted for the immediate salary cut rather than the delayed one. The conclusion drawn from this data was shown that temporal discounting is partially due to people's belief that gains will be followed by more and more gains, that losses will somehow be avoidable in the future. It seems like a reasonable explanation for why we would choose to have a reward now and delay losses for a future time. There are, however, compelling alternatives. Even the king of pop will age. One such explanation is related to the way we perceive our future selves. Imagine yourself in a year from today. You get up in the morning. Where do you live? Are you renting an apartment? Do you have your own house? Do you own a house? Get dressed. How do you look? Has your hair changed? What will you wear? Have breakfast. Coffee, cereal, toast and jam, scrambled eggs. Skip breakfast altogether. You kissed loved ones, children, husband, wife, goodbye, and head to work. Do you go there by car? Do you take subway? Do you work from home? You arrive at your job. What do you do? Do you work in an office? Are you self-employed? Have you already retired? Then around 1 p.m. you will take a lunch break. Are you eating healthy foods? Do you have dietary restrictions due to your physical condition? At the end of the day, you head out. Are you going home for dinner? Are you spending a night on the town? Will you watch a film? Will you go shopping? After you have carefully played out the scenario in your head, do it once more, only this time imagine yourself in 10 years. Take your time. When you are done going through a typical day in your life, a decade from now, do it again. This is the last time, I promise. But now imagine yourself 30 years from today. Try to imagine your day as much detail as you can. How similar are your future selves to your current self? Is the potential you from a year today more like yourself in the present than the potential you a decade from now? What about the future you 30 years from today? Can you recognize yourself in the person you imagine yourself in 30 years? It is not surprising that people feel more connected to their near future selves than their far future selves. We do not tend to picture ourselves very differently in a year's time. In a decade or two, though we certainly expect to have transformed quite a bit, we may consider our future selves in 30 or 50 years to be so different from our current selves that we think them to be different people altogether. If we perceive our future selves to be distinct agents from our current selves, strangers even, it is not shocking that we choose to indulge in the present and regulate pain to the faraway future. Yes, smoking and drinking today could mean increasing your risk of having a range of medical conditions in the future, but the person who will have to endure those illnesses does not seem to be you, and so you are less concerned with this future person than you are with the one reading this book. We would rather have to raise today than in a couple years, because we will receive the money, while in a few years a fuzzy version of ourselves will be enjoying it. You might not be keen to give your future self the dough, even though as you are to hand it out to a stranger on the street. Well, not quite, but you get the logic. As an fMRI study published in 2006 aimed at link the way we perceive our future selves, the way we discount time. While their brains were scanned, participants were requested to evaluate the characteristics of both their current selves and their potential selves 10 years from now. Later, outside the scanner, participants were asked to make decisions that would reveal their temporal preferences. Choices such as, would you rather get $20 today or $10 today or $12 in a week? Would you prefer $10 today or $15 in 2 months? They were presented. The findings show that people who tended to choose a small gain immediately rather than a larger one in the future had greater differences in their brain activity when thinking of their current selves versus their future selves. Participants who do not discount the future that much had only minor differences in activation when evaluating their current and future selves. In the spring of 2009, the pop star Michael Jackson, then 50 years old, announced his intention to go on tour for the very last time. The tour was scheduled to include 50 gigs at London's O area, a show for each year of Jackson's life, which ended unexpectedly before he had a chance to go on stage. Most of us would have thought Jackson would be financially set for retirement. Surely one of the most successful musicians of all time, who had been performing since the age of 5, could retire comfortably with no financial concerns. This was not the case. This Is It tour, as it's called, was supposed to get Jackson out of the deep financial fiasco he found himself in before his death. What drove the king of pop to leave behind a mountain of debt? Like many of us, his main fault seemed overspending and undersaving. Millions of dollars annually were spent on plane charters, purchases of antiques and paintings, and said Alvin Melnick, one of Jackson's advisors, there was no planning in terms of a location of how he he should spend. For Michael, it was whatever he wanted at the time he wanted. Michael Jackson was not alone. In 2005, the savings rate in the United States was negative for the first time since the 1930s. This meant that Americans were spending more than they were taking in after taxes. While Jackson's expenses included the $8 million annually for luxuries, his fellow citizens were taking more modest purchases, a new car perhaps. Nevertheless, those acquisitions made their retirement funds at risk. What drove Michael Jackson and his fellow Americans to negative savings rate? It may have been a bit of over-optimism. From 2002 to 2006, the value of people's homes was rising sharply. Believing this trend would continue, people felt that they could spend more. They are wrong. In 2008, real estate prices fell sharply. Although Americans started saving again soon after, savings rates were not enough to provide a quality of life after retirement that was equal to the one people were accustomed to during their working years. The second problem was that Michael Jackson, like many others, had a difficult time imagining himself at the age of 70. Even if we manage with some effort to imagine our aging selves, most people find the image aversive. Alas, thinking about retirement funds involves thinking about aging, as we would rather avoid the thought altogether. Many of us shun planning our financial future. End of chapter 7.